Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
You said you wanted a trampoline, so I decided I would try to give you a trampoline. But I'm not going very far. Why did you want a trampoline? You want some energy. You want some energy in our opening, didn't you, Marcus?
I watched a documentary about what's his name? Tom, whatever, that 6'9" guy who does self-help or whatever.
Tony Robbins.
Yeah, who's a very particular character, and he's Jesus Christ. He's got a trampoline. So before he steps on stage, he jumps on the trampoline and it psychs him up.
Yeah.
I want to be psyched up.
Right. Well, we don't have a trampoline, but I'm going to do a small segue here on our opener, all right? I really want us to talk more directly to the people who are making the time to come and spend with us and actually listen to the show. We are getting up into, more than 40 individual episodes that we've done. We're headed towards 50. We're not getting as much engagement from you, the listeners, as we want. So if you've got books you want us to read and authors you want us to talk to, let us know. If you've got a book that we know is coming up and you want to ask particular questions, give us the questions. So this is a huge call for you who are out there, A, saying thank you, and B, get involved.
Yeah, I think it's a really good thing to say. And I think we probably have to do a bit of work on that just to bring books forward, which ones we're going to be looking at next. And then actually there's the opportunity to do something about it. I think the other thing is also about, we hear a lot that we ask great questions, but I think we could be better. So if you hear a question, you go like, yeah, that was a low ball or something, or too simple. Just challenge us and go, why don't you ask about this in particular? Why don't you ask more about examples? Why don't you more like drill deeper into the subject matter? Because there's too many podcasts out there who just jamble on and no one gets anything out of it, and we don't want to be one of those. So tell us.
And on that note, Marcus, who's on the show today?
So today we're talking to Neil Usher in his book Elemental Change, which is a lot about change and transformation.
Right. And what were your big takeaways today, or at least one takeaway, because we did a bit of an opening ramble.
Yeah, I did one takeaway. I think it's one takeaway this time. It's about emotional, psychological, and physical safety in organizations. So interestingly, at the very, very last question, we got quite a bit into that. And it's a very important aspect of the future of organizations. And we sure had a lot of that last year to see that a lot of organizations are not dealing with this in the right way. So, and the safety, it covers everything from feeling that you can speak up to feeling that you can bring yourself in to the workplace, to have feel more purpose, and obviously to be, as a baseline, safe and not feel threatened and not feel, that your life or your health or your mental health is threatened at your workspace, which should never happen. But we've seen that there are certain places where seemingly organizations are not aware enough of that to that be in place in the right way. So I quite liked his answer on that we should really look at this. We should just call it safety, and it should really cover everything. Everyone should know what it means without explanation. That's my take.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that are talking about UBI, Universal Basic Income, as providing a financial safety net that allows people to think more clearly and more creatively because they don't worry about losing their job. They don't worry about not making their house payments. So it's an interesting kind of spin-off in addition that's outside the enterprise that governments and societies could indeed do. Now, I'm not saying it's good or bad or right or wrong, but I know it's another topic. But for me, the takeaway was all about vision. And if you're going to do big transformation within a large enterprise, you need to have a shared vision. And his interesting take on that was it's not a vision statement, it's a vision question. Because if you can come at it with a vision question, then everybody gets to answer it and you're engaging people in the transformation journey. So I think that was a really good kind of a way of positioning it. And he talks a lot more about it, of course, during the interview. And speaking of the interview, what should we do, Marcus?
Go there. Hello, everyone. Today we're here with Neil Usher. Hello, Neil, and thanks for being with us.
Hello, delighted to be invited. Thank you.
So, as usual, we start at top. So, please tell us a little bit of about who you are and why you wrote the book.
Okay, well, I've been in what's sort of loosely termed corporate real estate for almost 30 years, leading large scale workplace transformations, leading real estate projects in a number of countries around the world, and in the context of all of that, leading large scale change projects as well. Um, I've written two books, the first of which was The Elemental Workplace, that came out in 2018, and Elemental Change came out sort of late last year. Um, my current role is I am the Chief Workplace and Change Strategist at GoSpace AI, which is the first application of artificial intelligence to workplace planning. What's interesting about that really is that my last qualification was a master's in IT in 1991, so it's taken me almost 30 years, but I've finally got a job in tech.
Wonderful. So, quite early in the book, there's somewhere where you mentioned something along the lines of that success is often somewhat random because it's quite a complex thing. So, is the success of change really random?
It's a good question. I don't think it is. But what I think we need to be is better prepared, and that's sort of one of the key pillars of the book, if you like. Um, I think what's also really important is to always retain a sort of learner's mindset in everything we're doing. I think that helps us deal with the sort of unique characteristics of every situation we encounter. Very easy sometimes when faced with a challenge to think, oh, I've done this before, I've done something like this before, therefore all of the things that were previously true are going to be true this time around, which is very rarely the case. So I'm not necessarily sure it's to do with its sort of the success is to do with its randomness. I think it's more to do with the uniqueness of every situation we're facing. And that's why I argue that preparation is the key.
And I think preparation is really important, but one of our favorite expressions is to love the problem, not the solution. And getting the objective framed correctly, in my view, is the thing that most people fail to do efficiently. Like really define why are we changing, what are we trying to do, and what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve before they start off in the process. Too many times I've worked for digital agencies and they're leading a digital transformation project for some enterprise, which means building an app. How do you help enterprises start by defining what they're trying to do before they really start how they're doing it?
One of the the six components of the change operating system, which I offer as the sort of preparation tool, is opportunity. Opportunities obviously are time bound; they're not going to last forever. We sense from the sort of the movement of the pieces in front of us that there may be a gap, there may be somewhere that we can sort of move into to seize that opportunity. But something I rarely see in any organisation is any kind of attempt to map that opportunity to understand, how do we get here? Tracking some of the history. Most things that have happened in the past, there's been a reason for them. What were those reasons? Why are we where we are today? Looking then at that opportunity in the future, understanding the present, but looking at mapping the opportunity in the future in an inverse way that we normally map risk. Now, most organizations are hugely risk averse. They're really intent on driving uncertainty out of the organization. So they focus on mapping and mitigating risk. But if we actually flip that into the opportunities that we're facing and start to map opportunity in the same way, I think we do some vital work before we start getting into defining what it is we're about to change, defining what it is we want to do. So, understanding the opportunity and mapping that opportunity, I think, is a critical part of being prepared. Um, we wouldn't sort of go into the kitchen and start cooking before we've decided what it is we wanted to eat. And in going into that kitchen, we need to prepare ourselves. We need to have the ingredients, an idea of how we're going to get there, the timescales involved. Does anyone else need to be involved? We do a little bit of thinking before we just start getting all the stuff out and crack on with the cooking.
Mm. So, and everyone loves an opportunity, I'm pretty sure. And often when we go into the context of transformation, or generally any organization you look at any given time has issues. And Troy earlier mentioned there were problems, and you mentioned it before. There are problems before. There's a reason why change needs to happen, because things are not quite working in the right way. So how do you balance the difference between there's old things, there might be problems that might the organization is not fully aware of, and at the same time you're starting trying to do new things? How do you balance that? Or are you saying this needs to first be fixed before you can do something else? Or what's sort of the balance you need to strike in order to move on change and transformation in this sense?
I'm not sure that all change needs to be considered as a response to a problem, actually. I think we're brought up from a very early age to take a sort of problem mindset, which is identify what's wrong, somehow define that problem, look at a fix, look at an implementation, and then do some sort of review later. Methodologies like Six Sigma have sort of taken that on. But I think the danger is if we start to think that the only things we change are problems, then we're not necessarily taking advantage of the opportunities that are presenting themselves. Because sometimes it might be something new entirely. It might be a sort of a new opportunity. It might be due to those sort of, as I've described it, those sort of moving parts in front of us with the gap opening. There might be just something that interests us or excites us that we want to pursue, that we think is potentially sort of missing, but it might not necessarily be fixing a problem per se. I don't think our role in organisations is just to fix things that are breaking or already broken. They're actually to take advantage of the situations we see opening up in front of us. Sometimes to push those a little, but many of the ideas we have for things are sort of new creations, new services, new products within organisations, new applications within that sort of digital environment you described, rather than necessarily just trying to sort something that's broken. I don't think we should necessarily see ourselves as some sort of institutional, change of some sort of institutional maintenance program. I think it's more about discovering and seizing on those opportunities. We may, in the process, fix something that's broken, or we may move our way around it, or what was going on before that wasn't working effectively may no longer be needed in the process of seizing on that opportunity. But I think we need to sort of liberate ourselves a little from that sort of problem-oriented mindset, if that's possible.
Yeah, but if we look at my history with organizations, is what you're describing happens in the innovation lab, which is filled with kind of brightly colored beanbag chairs and lots of interesting agency people, and all of this kind of exploring opportunities and new services and things like that is sequestered and hidden away and hived off, as you say, to avoid the risk to the rest of the business. And I would love to see enterprises more broadly look at opportunities and not just through their innovation departments. How can we help them understand that everything isn't always so risky, and yes, you can involve the entire organization?
I think almost particularly as I've been involved in workplace design, I think almost the last place that an innovation is ever likely to happen is a room with innovation written in above the door. Um, most ideas come from usually from individuals in their own particular places that help them think, whether that's the shower or walking the dog or going out for a run or whatever it is, that sort of usually involving some degree of movement, because movement seems to stimulate that sort of innovative process in our minds. And we then need to bring people together to try and make that into reality. Um, but I think innovation comes potentially from everywhere in the organisation. I was doing some research a little while ago just for something to do with change around some of those innovations that have come from the sort of the shop floor, effectively, where someone has hit upon a really interesting idea, and usually it's hiding in plain sight. A lot of these amazing ideas are not something that are a group of people gathered around the whiteboard trying to solve a complex problem. These are very often just those moments of clarity that we all crave, really, and we all try to seek. where suddenly you realise that something could be different from the way it is now, or you hit on an idea that you think is is an absolute winner. And I think the art for organisations is to make sure they're receptive to that degree of thinking, that they have channels for those suggestions, that they're able to harness the collective sort of the creative power of the whole organisation, and not rely on an agency or a particular physical space, or a combination of the two to be the people that think of the ideas. They can come from everywhere, and most of the time, those people who are actually engaged in that activity are best placed to point out where something might be better, might be improved, or might be different.
Yeah. And when we take that, that gets us likely straight to enablement and empowerment, because in a lot of organizations, teams, people don't feel necessarily empowered to bring ideas anywhere and into fruition, or that they have time to be able to explore that, because there's the business as usual, there's the day-to-day tasks and so on. So tell us a bit about empowerment and enablement in organizations and how that plays a role in that context.
Empowerment is quite the buzzword, really. I mean, I think we've been using it
Yeah.
probably sort of overactively for the last decade or so. But having effective communication channels with an organisation for the sort of surfacing of ideas and innovations is absolutely vital. But I think that goes for the organisation across the board. Really, it's just having that degree of openness, having the ability for ideas to surface and ideas to be channeled. um, I can't see that there's a downside necessarily to that. Sometimes that could be some sort of platform that enables people to communicate in particular ways. Different organisations, that could be more of a sort of culturally engineered solution, but sort of open communication, feedback loop. It's part of the whole idea of perpetual beta, which is borrowed from software development. The idea that nothing is ever finished, that is always a work in progress, and that everything that's created really is being co-created with the consumers or the users of that particular product or service. So if we think about our workplace in the broadest possible sense, we're all involved in some degree of co-creation. So the mindset becomes one of experimentation. What we're actually saying is that nothing in this organization is ever finished. It's all a work in progress. It's a version number. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and improve it continually, trying to up those that numerical sequence to keep moving everything in that sort of experimental way. We have I mentioned earlier about the sort of desire to drive uncertainty out of organizations. Certainty creates sort of static situations which are never going to lead to innovation. They're never going to lead to sort of the ability to identify and drive change. So it's all linked. The welcoming of uncertainty, the welcoming of those spaces we can move into, the opportunity for co-creation, the whole organisation being able to work together in that way. It's all part of a sort of a way of living, a way of being within an organisation. But this sort of notion of experimentation, I think, is critical. And I think coming out of the pandemic, in a lot of situations, organisations are, I think, beneficially are going to find that they end up moving into much more of an experimental situation and an experimental mindset, because many of the challenges that we've been facing by virtue of being out of our workplaces at home, when we start to work together again, when organisations start to have to almost sort of recreate themselves to a significant degree in new ways, they're never all going to work straight out of the box. This is going to have to be a process of trial and error, open communication, open engagement with across the whole workforce with an experimental mindset, which means effectively then organisations will be sort of living, breathing vehicles for change. So I can see this is actually going to be quite an interesting and I think a really sort of optimistic period of time.
And what you're really talking about is some level of evolution. And you make the point in the book that Mother Nature has the luxury of time and the permission to experiment, and that Mother Nature is in a perpetual state of beta. Can you say a bit more about that and how Mother Nature succeeds even when enterprises don't?
Um, yeah, I was sort of looking at the difference between transformation and evolution, and it was interesting to discover that sort of in kind of biological terms, a transformation is actually quite a small but often unsuccessful event. But when it does happen in terms of one cell consuming another, on the odd occasion that it doesn't end up in a sort of fatal outcome, it can actually be quite interesting because something new is created. But just about everything in an organisation has to be a transformation. We like to sort of flag it up as being something significant, and we look upon evolution as actually being something fairly ponderous and sort of uninteresting. But actually, evolution can be fast, and evolution can be, evolution is much more the way that on a day-to-day basis we and our organisations change ourselves. Um, I think the difference really with nature is that we have a consciousness of that occurring, um, whereas in nature none of this is it doesn't necessarily have the luxury of time, but none of it is necessarily consciously driven, and that's really the sort of difference here. And probably in nature, the biggest threat to nature is humanity, really. So if nature doesn't have the benefit of time, it's probably our fault, really, at the end of the day. We're probably the biggest risk in that sense. Um, so I think just as long as we make sure that as we were talking about, sort of empowerment and enablement, then we can actually ensure that evolution continues to flow and take an evolutionary mindset. But I do in the book try to say that evolution isn't something that is to be sneered at. Evolution is actually the basis of change, and is something that can happen quickly and at a broad scale.
Yeah, and it's quite a nice notion to think that potentially the future shape of organizations might be just an inch a bit closer to what how nature actually works, because organizations seem to be very artificial forms of bringing people together and doing things. But if I look then if we're looking then at the enablement or empowerment or what we want to call that, what I've often found is that when you start enabling people, teams, and individuals to do certain things and bring certain things to the table, where it often seems to then um, get blocked is on prioritization. So, and that goes back again to organizations already have things that are going on. How do you then actually shift into saying to make space, right? There's some new ideas coming. We want to do something new. How can we prioritize the new 200 things that we found, or someone else found something, and now that we have enabled teams, they're coming with new ideas all the time. Sort of how can we balance then that in terms of where an organization should be going and things that are maybe on lower priority or that need to be solved in a different way? What's the balance to strike there?
Yeah, it's a fascinating change within organisations. As you say, there's always something going on. I think that
Hmm.
part of I don't really address it in the book, but part of the difficulty really is that we're brought into organisations as individuals. We're always expected to have a team mentality. We always get asked at our interview, are you a team player? Show me some examples of being a team player. But at the end of the day, in coming in on our own, we're still assessed on our own. What is it that you've done? What contribution have you made individually? Well, the team has done a fantastic job with this. No, I know the team's done a fantastic job with that, but what part of it did you play in all of this? So we're constantly asked about, we're constantly assessed on our own personal contribution as an individual within an organisation that actually wants its people to work together and work together productively. Um, so consequently, in that kind of situation, we're always looking to be involved in things. Everybody has to have something going on because that's how we prove our worth and our value to an organisation. You know, I've been involved in this project, and this one's been really successful, and I had a part to play in all of this. I think that makes working in teams hugely complicated. I think it makes prioritization hugely complicated. I think the more that organisations can organise themselves on the basis of purposeful teams, and it can actually, if it wants people to work as teams, can actually assess the contribution that teams are making collectively, the easier it will be to understand where priorities should lie. Because if we look at, we probably look at most of what is actually going on a day-to-day basis. These particular initiatives and projects that are being driven, we would probably actually, if we took a much more team-oriented approach, purposeful team-oriented approach, we'd probably scrap a lot of them because they weren't really making a significant contribution overall. We would also probably find that a number of them were either duplicating that effort or actually conflicting with other projects. It's one of the questions I always ask when I sort of start an engagement with any organisation is, well, what else is going on at the same time, or is about to be going on at the same time that might actually, overlap with, duplicate with, or conflict with what we're talking about doing here. It's usually not particularly offered, and the more digging you do, the more you find out that actually there's this complex web of projects which are all running at different speeds, different priorities. Stripping that back, I think, is part of the process of sort of almost de-individualizing the corporation, and creating it and managing it much more as a series of interlocking teams with particular purpose and particular priorities.
I've worked for some really large corporations. I mean, very, very early in my career, I worked for McDonnell Douglas, which was eventually purchased by Boeing. I've worked for Nokia. We did a partnership with Intuit. So I understand these kind of big, huge organizations, many of which are multinational or global corporations. And yes, the concept of teams and multiple projects and multiple priorities kind of going on in the background, competing for attention and competing for resource. I think one of the other things that I've seen that's a real challenge is clarity of vision from the leadership. A team needs to absolutely understand where we're going. It needs to be communicated, and all the teams and all the other areas also need to agree this is where we're going. And yet, when I look at KPIs or OKRs or whatever it is, too often they do not roll up. They do not make sense because at some point there's a breakdown in the organization where somebody's trying to build a fiefdom or they're trying to do a power grab or something else. Can you talk about the importance of leadership and vision in these kind of projects, especially for larger enterprises?
Leadership and vision are two of the components of the six making up change operating system. If I can just pick up on vision for a moment, because there's a lot talked about with leadership, and vision probably doesn't get quite the attention it needs, and I agree with you in terms of its importance. Became rather fascinated really by the idea of vision being a question rather than a statement, and then started really looking into sort of what a question does for us and what a question does to our brains, and this notion that a question kind of hijacks the brain really. Once it's asked of you, you can't help it, but you have to try and answer it. But we're very familiar with vision statements. This is going to be the case, or this is our target, or this is what we're going to do in the next 3 years. We're going to be the number one provider of vacuum cleaners. Supposing we actually ask that as a question, and we actually engage people in thinking about the contribution that potentially can be made to that, and whether that actually is that target achievable at all, or is it even too easy a target to achieve? Can it be pushed beyond that? But actually to say, how can we become the world's premier producers of vacuum cleaners, rather than saying we will become this, actually then says we're involved. It actually says to everybody in that organisation, you've got a role to play in all of this. So suddenly we're asking people, well, what do you think? How do we get there? What can you do? What can your teams do? What do you think we ought to do? It's first of all a call for contribution, which is a great thing in terms of the insight, and something we talked about earlier with the sort of ideas that people have been harbouring for some time. It might surface some of those, but mainly it's a sense that we're all included and we're all in this together, and actually it's sort of galvanising in that way. So the idea of a vision being pitched as a question I think is a fantastic sort of way of showing this, and I see very few vision questions. I see a huge number of vision statements, But I think if we could move it in this direction, we would really see some actual sort of, at various levels of the organisation, a lot more willingness to be involved in the initiative, and a lot more willingness to give of insight and to show, really from experience where they think that contribution could be made. So agree entirely that a vision is important, but I don't necessarily think it's a case of just telling people what we're expecting them to do. I think asking them is a great way to do it.
I think it's a great notion to talk about vision more as a question. It's a great point. And talking about questions, we're at the point again where we have more questions than time. So I'll have one last one before we unfortunately have to wrap up. And I'd like you to give us your view a little bit on the role of emotional safety, because we talked earlier about individuals and their value to the organization and teams and the dynamics. So emotional safety is a big theme that pops up everywhere. What's your view on that in particular, please?
Um, what I picked up on a lot before writing the book was the notion of psychological safety, which includes the emotional components and really sort of centres around that. This idea really that we're actually not in a safe space, because the safe space tends to be where we bury things and we don't want to actually engage, but um, we can freely feel certain things, we can say certain things without fear that we're going to be unnecessarily judged or prejudiced in any way. That actually it's a place for it's been described as a place for sort of safe conflict, rather than just being a safe place where we don't have to engage with our colleagues. The thing I really struggle with, I think, is that it's a term that's 40 years old, and it really hasn't resonated much outside of either sort of academia or sort of certain pockets of HR. It's something that feeling that way and feeling that we are in a safe environment where we can think, we can feel, and we can act in a safe way in an organisation is absolutely vital. If we want people to engage, if we want them to be involved, if we want them to give us our insight and all the things we've been talking about up to this point, they need to feel that they can freely do that. But if we're struggling with a concept, and we've been struggling with a concept for 40 years to land that and to make it understandable, then we've got a problem with that. We're not getting anywhere. And I find every time that psychological safety is mentioned, it needs an explanation. I've given an explanation now. I'm sure some people listening will have heard it. I'm sure that for some it's new. It shouldn't be new, because everybody should be in an environment such as this in their workplace on a day-to-day basis. So everybody should be able to refer to it. And we've also seen that physical safety has been excluded from that, or talked about differently. Physical safety is something for the health and safety department or the facilities department. It's operating procedures that will keep people safe. But we've seen through the pandemic, people didn't used to know what PPE stood for. Everybody knows that it's personal protective equipment. PPE is now sort of an everyday term, whereas it used to be a very niche term in a niche part of the organisation. The Me Too movement brought to light the physical threat that a lot of women felt in the workplace, and they were able to start freely talking about it and calling this out. So I've also worked in a few fairly remote communities at times with large corporations, where there are particular sort of production or sourcing centres in different parts of the world, where we're in a very different experience in those locations, because the whole community virtually works at the particular plant or factory concerned. And so any sort of initiatives that are mounted from the sort of central corporate organisation really, and are brought to some of these communities, you can feel very different being in these places than you would ordinarily feel in the city centre in the corporate HQ. It's a very different environment. So I think there's a whole raft of physical safety considerations going on as well. So I suggest in the book that if we've really struggled to land psychological safety, and we've excluded physical safety from most of our considerations in this respect, that actually it's time we just called it elemental safety. It's time that it actually we could actually draw around, not just feeling, not just thinking, but acting and being physically safe in a working environment at all times. And really, where that's headed is we should drop any prefix. So it's elemental because it's a basic safety we should all expect. But at some point in the near future, we should just be able to call it safety. And then everyone will actually understand what that means. They'll understand that they can expect that in any working environment they go into. And they then know that if it's not safe in every one of those respects, that it will be legitimate on their part to call it out, to raise it, and to make sure in the future that it is. So I think really instead of using difficult, complex terms, it's the entire length and breadth of safety that we should expect in the workplace.
That's a really, really important and great notion, and a wonderful wrap up to this one. So thank you so much for that. So Neil, thanks so much for your time and for your insights, and for spending some time with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Great to talk to you.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.